This is a conversation with Maisie. What's your last name again, Maisie?
Upson.
Upson. Yeah. And this is for the podcast Ocean to Ocean and Nothing Media. And Maisie, I actually don't know too much about you, Maisie, but we've been friends for about 6 months now. I know we had a mutual friend that introduced you to the group that I host twice a week.
Mhm.
And I've just really enjoyed all of your contributions to the group, and you have a very peaceful presence. You have very clear insights and sharing, and we spoke a few weeks ago, and we were sort of talking about what this awakening process has been like for both of us. And
Yep.
there might be some similarity there in a way that I
Mhm.
wanted to explore in this interview, although also different.
Yeah.
And with that as an introduction, how would you like to introduce yourself?
Uh, okay. Um, I'll introduce myself as a person to start with. Hello, I'm Macy. Um, yeah. So when we were talking the other week, I initially called you and I was like, "What is this?" I was like, "What? What is this whole?" I think I asked something about not about the awakening process, but something related to that because I was interested in how like everyone has this awakening process, but like views the entire thing differently. And I wanted to call you to talk to you about like the very biased perspective of mine that I realized I had about this whole awakening or non-duality concept.
Hmm. Yeah, that's coming back to me now. Yeah, that is how our conversation started. And so what was that bias, and how did our conversation affect that?
Um, so my bias is that I realized that I view everything in reality, um, including this concept of non-duality. Like to me, it's just a perspective shift, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But I realized that the bias that I had was that I viewed everything in reality and every way in which I perceive reality to just be connected to how the mind works and how the mind perceives things. And like that's not necessarily a bad thing, and I know that, and that's due to my experiences, and that's fine. But I was curious, I was aware of that bias, and I was curious to hear about other people's biases if they're aware of them.
Yeah, yeah, no, this touches on a lot, or this, yeah, brings a lot of things to mind I'd like to touch on in this conversation um, already. Yeah, so, yeah, and I think you might have even used the word brain, saying that you had this feeling or belief. I guess it would be a belief or a thought in the brain, maybe, you know, presumably this that everything you experience is in the brain. Is it something like that?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so for me, in terms of the non-duality call that we have gotten to know each other through, I perceive and think about the concept of this non-duality thing just as like a perspective shift. It's just like how you view things in reality. And to me, like perspective shifts, yeah, they're all about the brain, and it's just how your brain chooses to perceive things. But I mean, it's then there's the whole concept of and debate of like free willpower and stuff like that. But that's a different topic.
That is, and we could probably get to that too. But yeah, it's right. Okay, so that's a great starting point. Mm, yeah, so it would appear that everything happens in the brain, and some non-dual teachers, historically use words like consciousness and awareness, and to say it's all happening in the brain, there's something reductive about that, that's both Like it takes away the mythology, it takes away all the woo-woo factor, because you could dissect the brain and it's a physical thing you could put on a table. You can't put awareness or consciousness on a table. But at the
Yeah.
at the same time, I think I probably communicated my reluctance to only put it that way um, because I just don't know. To me, it's more of just a mystery that the brain is certainly an apparent component to, why how my mouth can move and yap sounds that your ears hear and somehow interpret. All of this appears to be happening through weird things in the brain, but ultimately what's behind all of it, what's at the bottom of all of it, seems to me like unknowable.
Yeah. So touching on like something you just said, from my perspective at least, it's
Yeah,
to an extent like making it all, or like making the reasoning behind everything like due to the brain kind of does like release, maybe not release, but like relieve you of like, oh, okay, it's just of the brain, that's fine. But like nothing, we really don't understand many things about the brain at all. And so even if you do say it's just the brain, like what does that actually mean? And like how can you actually defend that? And like you can't really, you can for some things maybe, but it's difficult.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that was so. Yeah, this brings to mind, and I, I feel like we're going to revisit our previous conversation, for
Yep.
this talk here, because yeah, when you talk about the brain, it reminds me of these teachers or non-teachers, Michael Markham and Nancy Nethercutt, which I don't think you're familiar with necessarily.
Not really.
No,
I vaguely have heard of them.
yeah, which is totally fine, but it reminds me because they actually put it very similarly to you. So that was very that perked my ears when you said perspective shift in the brain. That's exactly how Michael Markham describes it. And he was basically a really intense seeker who read every book on the planet and traveled on non-duality and traveled to see teachers like Rupert Spira and Adyashanti, and at the end of it all, like, this is the way he puts it, that it's a perspective shift that happened in his brain, and he actually can. And this is where the conversation went that I want to revisit, is because my next question to you when you told me that was, I asked you, was there a particular moment where this perspective shift happened, like instantaneously, and you were never the same again? Because this is basically more or less how Michael Markham and Nancy Nethercutt described their experience.
Right. Okay. There is no simply quick way to put this, so I apologize ahead of time.
But we have time.
Oh goody. When you asked me, when you asked me that question, it's a really like loaded question to an extent, because it wasn't as if I woke up one day or like realized something. I'm like, oh, everything changed. It's fine. Like it wasn't that easy. So for me, and one of the reasons I initially called you was because I was curious about this like journey that people seem to go on. Because like oftentimes in our non-duality group, sorry, it's all gonna tie back around, but oftentimes in our non-duality group, we all have conversations and people talk about like struggling on this journey that they went on, and I was like, what are they talking about? Like I have no idea what that is. I know what it is based on like what they've said about it, but I haven't. I didn't acknowledgeably. I didn't noticeably like go through such a journey, because I didn't initiate this journey on my own. But to answer your question of like this, whether or not this moment happened, is like it wasn't. If this moment happened, this moment was the series of like 7 years. It was not like a single moment, but at the same time, I wasn't consciously aware that I was like searching for one thing. So what happened to me is I had a severe traumatic brain injury like almost 7 years ago. And I woke up out of a coma. I was in a coma for like 2.5 weeks. I woke up out of a coma, didn't remember anything about the world, had to relearn how to walk, how to talk, how to eat, how to sleep, how to sleep, no, how to eat, how to do math, how to write, how to do everything again. And with so the brain also from that event, the brain recovered in a very, like, it takes a long time. It takes a long time for the brain to recover from such a severe injury. And so over the course of the next 7 years following that accident, I was constantly thinking about, I was just constantly aware of my own brain, because I was also aware of my brain, like, while I was learning all of these things. Because something you said earlier that caught my interest is that we all talk, and it's like, I can say things and I can say words and you somehow like hear them and understand them, and that's all happening in your brain, but like, what does that really mean? Yeah. But like, I experienced like how the brain develops all of that again.
That's incredible.
And so yeah, and so that's what eventually led to me claiming like non-duality and all that as a perception. I have to plug in my computer. Could you give me a moment?
Sure, I'll pause.
Sorry, thanks.
Okay, unpause. So, yeah, absolutely. And so from our previous conversation, when you told me all of this, I don't actually remember if you, I think you might have actually asked me first what my experience was like.
Yes.
And that might have, and then maybe you told me your story in response to it. So, because yeah, first I asked you, it's funny, it's like that my memory, I rarely want to just go into my memory and recreate something, but I feel like it's an interesting flow that, because what you said reminded me of these other people who talked about a shift in perspective that was immediate for them. And when you said no, then I said, oh, well, yeah, well, for me, and you might have asked me what it was like for me or is like, because I'm not claiming I've, had any particular shifts that anyone else has had, for the record. But yeah, and to me, it feels like just a total unknowable, just at the moment, that's what I could say. But for me, there was this moment in my life, there are in fact multiple periods of my life, all of the moments that felt the most closely associated with what I would call awakening. They all, across the board, involved a great deal of loss of something. And usually a loss of some identity that was wrapped up in some group I was a part of, or some relationship I was a part of, or the big one really for me, or one of the bigger ones, was about 7 or 8 years ago. I hurt my foot, and then I wasn't able to do anything I did before then. I couldn't do my job downtown in Austin. I couldn't play music live, which I was doing 4 or 5 times a week at that point in Austin, and about to plan a tour around the country. And then not only that, but all my friends disappeared, which was very surprising. And I didn't have a girlfriend at the time, but my ex-girlfriends just weren't there for me. I wound up having 2 friends that emerged that were very special friends to this day that I really value. They're like true friends, really beautiful people that emerged. But all these other people I was seeing every single week and I thought were my friends just kind of disappeared. And if any of them are listening right now, I mean, I'm not mad at anyone for it. It's just, this is what happened. And it led to a sort of loss of identity, because I didn't realize, and it was very painful, extremely painful. I mean, I was actually in a really painful physical situation with my foot and I couldn't walk, but far more painful was the loss of these activities that I identified with, like as in all the, and so I just didn't know who I was. And then a few months later, and it was painful though, it wasn't like liberating or anything like that. And I wasn't even seeking anything at the time, to be honest. I had in the past, but I was just happy with my life at the time. I mean, it was fun. And I felt like I was doing good things with my music and working at like a vegan restaurant and stuff like that.
Yes.
And then about 6 months later, I met a friend online who introduced me to Ramana Maharshi, and something about reading his words, it just started to open something up, and a deep peace started to emerge. And when I learned about this self-inquiry process, practice or non-practice, it was a process of many years of that softening for me. And then there's more has happened in my story since then that has sort of changed the way I look at some of this. But basically, like, the whole point of it was that I didn't have like a traumatic awakening, which that's what I've heard from Michael and Nancy, that the actual awakening, the shift, was very immediate, very sudden, and very terrifying. And because it was the loss of everything that the mind had identified with as being who they were, and everything was seen through, and it was just totally traumatizing. But then it was liberating shortly after, whether that was the next day or the next process over the next year. People would have to look up their stories to hear what they say about it. But for me, it felt like I had been so traumatized through loss of what I identified with that, like physically, that wasn't happening so much with the actual spiritual awakening process. That to me, that was more just, I can't even describe it, but and at the same time, I can relate to when people say that it's scary, because I've felt that. But to me, I love it. I love the feeling of not knowing who I am or what anything is really. And so there, I just talked a lot, and I think this is what stirred something up in your mind that you could relate to. As far as for you, this was a very traumatic, not just the actual injury, but having the loss of what you identified as.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's like, I'm very sorry for the traumatic things you've been through, but I love the fact that I can connect with so much with what you said. Like, it's awesome.
Awesome.
But yeah, so like quickly connecting to my stories, like, yeah, okay. So in my story, like, yes, I had a traumatic brain injury, et cetera, et cetera. I had to relearn everything, whatever. But like when I woke up out of my coma, I had severe amnesia. And it wasn't severe amnesia. Amnesia is when you don't remember anything. Like there's two different kinds of amnesia. And there's a kind of amnesia where you don't remember anything in the past. And there's also the kind of amnesia where you can't remember anything that's currently happening. And I had both for a very long time.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it's, again, the brain is weird, and we don't understand everything about it, or much at all about it. Yeah. But it was weird because even though I constantly was forgetting things, like, and I was living life and trying to recover from this situation that I didn't know whether or not I would ever be able to recover from, even though I couldn't remember the things, I had this feeling of familiarity. There was somewhere in my body or my brain, I don't know, that could remember the fact that I had done this activity a million times. And so with that, okay, so making a full story here. It's like, sorry, I'm kind of jumping around.
Take your time. Take your time.
So I woke up out of the coma, couldn't remember anything of the past, which that was like, I would say that for me, and realizing to the extent that I like would probably never get those memories back. And I lost my sense of self. Like, I had no sense of self. I woke up with a body and I was like, what the fuck is this for? Like, I was just like flailing. I wasn't flailing around my arms because I couldn't move, but I was doing things. And like, my body it was amazing because like my body, when I was in my coma, like my body did stuff that was in response to pain. But like when I woke up out of the coma, I had to relearn how to like sit up and walk, but consciously, because I didn't remember anything. I just woke up and I was like, what? I was like, what is this body? I have 10 fingers. Like, what are those for? Like, why? Like, what does any of this do? Because I couldn't move at the time either. So like I couldn't understand the concept of like, oh, I have 2 legs so I can walk. It was just like, what? Like, what now? So that was like obviously like a huge loss of sense of self, like entirely. Like, my sense of self was gone. And so it's interesting. Again, trauma is terrible because I've experienced it as well. It's awful, but it's quite interesting because I feel like maybe, at least based on like my story and your story, like if people experience that trauma, like that is the moment. Like it's not their perspective shift moment, but it's the moment when like they have let go of everything that they have known to be themselves. And so that's the painful part. And then over time, for me, I had a similar experience where like so the perspective of non-duality, I kind of came to just on my own. I didn't know non-duality was a concept. I didn't know anything about speakers or whatever they're called, or like the people who have talked about non-duality before. Had no idea. I was just like talking. I was sitting in a hammock. Actually, it was this last summer too. I'm sitting in a hammock, just like reading Plato's Republic with my friend, and we were just talking about stuff and life, because why not? And we were talking about philosophies, because I like to talk about philosophies a lot. And we, through our discussion, we just like came to this conclusion of like the reality or of the concept of non-duality. And to me, it was the same thing where I was like, yeah, I was like, it's awesome. So, like, to me, it just like, it seemed so, I mean, like, to me, it is the truth of just how reality is. Like everything is made from my perspective, like from my perspective, the concept of non-duality is that everything that exists around you in your reality is a product of how you perceive it, right?
Right.
And so for me, like after I had lost everything, and then like realizing this, like for me, like realizing this life truth, and what I define as like a life truth of non-duality, I was like, yeah, I was like, best day ever. It was great. I didn't have that suffering and loss because maybe I had already experienced it.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. To me, it felt like it's like the faint remains of the clinging on, where the mind is still like missing something, but it knows it's gone, and it's only painful to want it again, or to think there's something else to want. And then, yeah, that's why this could feel so blissful, maybe, is because when you see that this is all just a story created by the brain or whatever it is, and that I don't know what anything is ultimately. I don't know what it means to say I exist or anything exists. There's just a freedom, there's a relaxation in that. Like, it's like, oh my God, it's just, you don't even need to call it anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So, okay, from my perspective of non-duality, of the fact of it being like a perspective shift, I think a lot of freedom came with the fact that I could take the idea of non-duality or the perspective of shift of non-duality and apply it to the world. And I was like, wait, everyone's in the same situation. We're cool. I was like, it's all fine.
And why was that an important thing to realize? Was it because it took away the competitive feeling, or the feeling of not being not that someone else had something you didn't or something?
No, it's not competition or like greed for something that I don't have. It was the fact that like, so from my previous experiences, like it was really, really hard. Like life was really, really hard. And like I had that perspective shift, or like the reality that I was reconstructing, I guess, because I had to like relearn everything, including all my perceptions of the world. But that was really hard, coming into the world, being thrown into the world like with an adult body, like as an adult. And they were like, cool, go live on your own now. And I was like, I just learned how to walk 6 months ago. Cool. It was like really scary. But I think with that, like that understanding, like the understanding and the concept of non-duality became my reality, like quickly became my life and my understanding of reality. But I didn't know how to put it in such a way, like I didn't know how to phrase it, or I think about it in such a way where I could apply it to other people, or where it could be applied to other people. And so I was very like kind of off in my own little like, what the hell is the world, like bubble for like kind of 7 years. And then once I was able to phrase it and like understand it in the same way that like non-duality, the concept of non-duality puts it, I was like, that totally makes sense. And also that's something Hmm. No, that's not it. Sorry. Just gonna go back on something I just said. But you could, with this concept of non-duality, I could put the truths that I had come to through my recovery experience in the previous like 7 years, and I could centralize it to one thing that like to me stood as a truth to the entire world. It's like everyone in the world. And I was like, nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So it did answer whatever questions you had or uncertain. It's interesting. It brought about a certainty for you in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, but we're just like the thing I was thinking about while I was describing this, and I was like, that's kind of weird. But it's true.
It's interesting because would you say that maybe paradoxically or apparently paradoxically that there's also an uncertainty in it? Or sort of,
I mean, it's the certainty that everything's uncertain.
Right.
And like that's beautiful. I mean, because like that was like that's a good phrase to apply to what I just said. Like that was my experience of the last 7 years of my life, but it was so difficult to relate to anyone else about that because like no one else. If I said that to other people, they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "But everything's uncertain."
Right. Well, what is it fair? Would it be fair to say? Tell me if this makes sense or not, or if this expresses your experience or not. But in this experience of coming from total amnesia, both kinds of amnesia, as you said, and needing to retrain your body to walk through your brain, like your body was physically healthy, it was the brain that had to be retrained, basically, more. Yes. And so I think you said something last time we spoke about like the whole sense of a self, of being Maisie and knowing what that means wasn't quite like, as memories came back, was there an element of like just how arbitrary it felt, like, oh, my brain wants to call this a self or something, but this is just my brain functioning? Was there some element of just observing what your brain was doing, and in that way no longer feeling compelled to say there is a separate self?
Yeah, so I would say the second thing you said is definitely true. So as my memories were coming back, I was observing them more as just like functions of the brain, like things my brain can recall. But also like through that experience, I was consciously aware of the fact that memories are super inaccurate, which is true. Memories aren't accurate. Even if you think they're super, super real, they're probably at least like 50 to 70% unreal. And I just like became aware of that because as I recalled memories, I would like ask, because what else do? I would ask my family like what happened, and their memories were different. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know whose memory is true. It's either yours or mine or neither. But also with that, when those memories came back, they came back just as like images. I had no emotional connotation with anything. And I think the emotional connotations, okay, this is me just philosophizing about neurology or neuroscience for a second. So I think that the emotional connotations that you have associated with memories, or like even your ideas of something, like something you see today or tomorrow or whatever, like the emotional connotations you have with those things is a large part of what constitutes like the self. But I didn't have that. So even if I had memories, like I can tell you something I did when I was 6, but like I don't have any it doesn't have any significance for me. Because it's like, yeah, it happened. I did it. That's cool. Like, that's it.
Yeah, that's interesting. The emotions are such a key part of our story. The story only makes sense, and yeah, I can't imagine really what that would even feel like, but I could definitely see how some shift of memory, that extreme where memories come back but there's no emotion connected, how that would really get you to question a lot of other things, maybe. Yeah. So how has it progressed since then, or let's say since last summer? What's been has anything changed in your perspective since you had, that cool conversation with your friend?
I mean, to honestly answer your question, yes, because my perspective is still changing all the time because I'm a human and perspective changes are fun.
Yeah.
In
They're fun. That's such a. I just want to highlight that. That's a great way to put it. It's actually fun to have a perspective change.
I mean, it is like they're difficult. It's not super easy to have a perspective shift, especially when you are dealing with a bunch of other things in your life. If like a perspective shift comes along and it's like, I'm sneak in here and you're like, no, I have so much other crap to do. Like, please come on. But like they're really cool because you realize things about yourself and you realize things about your beliefs about reality and the people around you. I think they're great, but really hard, but really great.
Well, and they often come from some kind of, like I had this really heavy emotions just this past week over something that then led to this beautiful opening. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I don't expect these things to ever stop shifting. I don't see how they could, because from my perspective, it all just happens through this body. Like Nisargadatta said, that all you can know is the consciousness from your body. Mm-hmm. He claimed that there was something prior to that, and that does resonate for me personally, that there is this prior wholeness that everything is appearing as. That is one way to put it, but I feel like but whatever we perceive, whatever we think, whatever we feel, this is all just like totally tied to our body, and our body's never just going to like turn into a ball of light that never changes. It's always going to change, and I guess I'm just throwing that out there in response to what you said.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to reply to that unless you have like another point to make out of it.
Well, no, you don't have to reply to that. Maybe you could, go ahead and continue your answer to my previous question as far as like what perspective shifts have happened since the big one, if you want to call it that, from last summer.
It's okay. Something that is interesting to me. It's like you just referred to that perspective shift that happened this last summer when I was talking with my friend as like the big perspective shift. But to me, I didn't necessarily think of it as like a big perspective shift. It was something that like when I realized it, I was like, that's awesome. And then I like kept on living my life. I was like, okay, cool, like done. And I mean, of course, because I think that perspective is great. It's played into how I live my life. But it hasn't been something that I've gone out of my way to be like super consciously aware of all the time. It's just like, realize this thing, cool.
That makes total sense, Maisie. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I mean, for thousands of years, people have been calling this totally ordinary. There's a Zen tradition of just, like there's this saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. That there's actually no change, and yet the perspective has changed deeply. And there's another modern speaker who I really enjoyed, Paul Hederman, who says, you can't use non-duality for anything. Like if you try to use it to solve problems of duality, it's going to fail you every time. And yet the paradox is the non-duality perspective, if that shift happens, it does make everything lighter, less heavy, and sort of as a byproduct. Oh, Maisie, did you freeze? Hold on. Yeah, so it's unpaused now and with the connection going now. So, the can't use non-duality for duality. What are your thoughts on that concept?
When I think about it, to me at least, it's I think if you're trying to like bring a non-duality perspective to unjustify, I guess, like duality, like it's not going to work because you're comparing one perspective to another. And technically, like no perspective is wrong. It's just that, like one might be better for some people than others, and like that's okay. But the other thing you mentioned the other thing it made me think about is the fact that I don't know. It's like when you said that when a person like gets this non-dual perspective, then they kind of drop this argument. And I think to me at least, like when that happened, I stopped arguing for it because it like no longer mattered. I was like it no longer matters whether or not someone has a dual perspective or a non-dual perspective. It's like, I mean, because to me it's like a perspective shift. It's like just because you have a perspective shift and it's awesome for you doesn't mean it's awesome for everyone. And like that's okay. Like it's awesome for you, that's awesome. If it's not awesome for you, then hopefully you have another perspective shift. Like it doesn't quite matter. Like it, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a great point. This really has no feeling of needing to proselytize attached to it or convince anyone of anything. Because there's a very deep feeling that things can't be other than they are, and whatever someone's experience is, that's what it is.
Exactly. And like with that, it's like if someone's perspective on life is dual, then that's how it is, and like that's okay. Like it's not it's not a philosophy to like be prescribing to other people. Like it's none of your business. It's just like if it's how you want to be the world, cool. That's fine.
Absolutely. Yeah. So all right. Yeah. So but tying that in with the thing I said earlier, actually, so the context I would usually say that in, you can't use non-duality to solve problems of duality, is so like let's say if you're having a trouble with the relationship or a sort of neurotic tendency or unhealthy, addiction, then like maybe a 12-step program is helpful, maybe seeing a therapist is helpful, or doing some other trauma work, is helpful, or creative expression. All of these things can exist. They all do exist, arise within non-duality, and non-duality doesn't solve problems. Like you still need to like eat the right diet and take the right medicine for an illness.
Yeah. So like on that note, it's sorry, wait, give me a second to think about. Like it doesn't change anything that is. Even if you see everything, like okay, so from my perspective of non-duality, everything, like I give meaning to everything around me. And like I give it the meaning to which that thing has for me. So for example, the plant I'm looking at right now, I love the baby. I love plants. If actually, okay, so this is a brief random story. But to exemplify this, when I was in high school, my house, or my parents' house, I guess, was in a fire danger zone. So we went on an evacuation notice, and I spent an hour like helping my family gather all their stuff and like put it in their car so we could just drive away. And I don't know where we ended up going. And after an hour of like helping everyone else out, like I looked at my car, I like got into my car and like I looked at the things in my car and I had 9 plants and that's it. I was like, good. I was like, these are the only things I care about. So like that's, I mean, like that's, for me, like that's what was valuable. And so it's, okay, so this is kind of like a loose connection, but it's, to me, that's very similar to like the non-dual perspective. It's like if the non-dual perspective works for you to like help solve things, like that's great, but like it's not going to change the fact that there's a fire. Like things happen, like, and there's things in a dual or non-dual world, or like whatever your reality is, regardless of whether or not you see those things as dual or non-dual, like they're going to be there regardless. Like the non-dual perspective it's not like alchemy. I mean, maybe it can be to some extent, but it's not a prescription for alchemy.
right. And it's
like, I have a non-dual perspective, and now I can do anything, and everything has a specific whatever.
yeah, yeah. Like somebody asked Ramana Maharshi, like, if nothing exists and there's no one this is happening to or for, then I could do whatever I want, right? And he says, yeah, you can do whatever you want. Like you could, rob from some people as long as you're okay if like they catch you and kick you on the ground afterwards because no one's there. It's all okay. It's all okay, but it doesn't actually change cause and effect in this apparent, realm of cause and effect.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's you're. So I think this is another reason why I classify, I guess, or categorize non-duality as like a perspective shift, because it's like it's how you're viewing reality. It doesn't actually change anything in reality, though. Like consequences, like that's not in your control. You can look at a fire and be like, I don't think it's gonna hurt me, and then walk into it and see what happens. But like, it's probably not gonna change the fact that it will probably hurt you.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. And then right before I brought up that quote, and there was this other quote I mentioned from Zen. I think it's a Zen Buddhist saying that before awakening, chop wood, carry water. After awakening, chop wood, carry water. And you nodded your head in that. So that, what would you like to say on that? I mean, how does that resonate?
I mean, it resonated with what we were previously talking about, where like for me, it like wasn't really different. Like it was just a conversation, and I was like, nice, that's a really cool perspective. I'm gonna write that down. And I probably wrote it down somewhere that I never saw again. And then just continued living my life. And the next morning I was like, cool, I'm gonna go to work now. I just did whatever I did.
Wow. Well,
so I think that quote is very true.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, you brought up the topic of free will earlier. Is that something you have a perspective on, and has that changed with this shift?
Ooh, free will is a fun one. It's okay. Philosophically, I think it can get really complicated, but not going down that philosophical line or any of those philosophical lines. Yeah. I mean, okay, so like as a person, and this is also a perspective thing. As a perspective, yeah, I believe in free will. Like I believe in radical freedom. So like a person can do. In the end, a person can make the choice to do anything that they want to do or not. I think people are in different situations that make them more inclined to do certain things than others. And like what you are inclined to do depends on your experiences and your perspectives. So maybe if you have a non-dual perspective, then you'll be put in a certain situation and respond to it in a certain way because you have this belief that therefore influences your free will in a certain way. And it's kind of like going back to the fire example. It's like you have the free choice to walk into that fire if you really want to, but you also have the free choice to say no. And that's my perspective on free will. That's all I have to say.
Interesting. Well, I guess I guess I disagree, or that's not my experience at the moment. But also I could be fooling myself. Like I really don't know what anything is ultimately. I feel like, to me, it does seem like everything has, this one teacher, Ramesh, said everything is due to genetics and up-to-date conditioning of the body and environment. And so, it's hard for me to see where free will would emerge from when everything feels semi-traceable to a previous thing, and ultimately nothing has any root cause. So it's all a mystery. So in that sense, I don't really think about free will at all. But I know during the Nothing conference, it was a topic that it was actually the most commonly asked question of people who were attending. Was they would ask every single speaker, is there free will or not? And I'm sure different people gave different answers. And another thing that comes to mind, which I just find like an interesting answer, for the record, I don't put the answers of any speaker on that high of a pedestal, but I I find them as interesting things to bounce off of, because ultimately I feel like there is no bottom answer to things really, but this is how we wouldn't be able to have a conversation if that's all we said, you know? And but Ramana Maharshi, apparently somebody asked him if there was free will. He got asked that dozens of times. One of the times he answered and said, as long as there's a belief in a separate entity, you know, or as long as there's a belief that you are the body, and is the way he put it, then there is free will. Like as long as there's a sense of a self, that self includes a sense of free will. And I'd also like to say, I feel like there's this other Zen saying I like to bring up that I haven't yet. That first there's mountains, then there's no mountains, then there's mountains again. And yeah, and so there could be this period where everything feels non-existent and empty. And then, as Nancy Nethercutt calls it, the fullness might rush back in. And all of a sudden there's mountains again. And you know that they're not really there, or they're not, it's just the brain doing its thing to say that they're there and they're call it a mountain. But it's just labels. There's actually nothing and no separation. All right, I went on a few rants there. Feel free to respond to any of that.
No, you're good. It's actually, it's actually super interesting. So relating to what you said about, I think you said Ramana Maharshi said this. Sorry if I mispronounced his name. Again, I don't know any of the speakers or anything.
You got it right.
Nice. Okay. So you said that. Oh yeah, that he thinks that like there's only free will if there's the identity of a self as well. And like I understand what he's saying, or at least my interpretation of what he's saying. I understand it. But I think to some extent. So the whole loss of self is definitely something I can identify with, right? That was my past, that is my present. Like, I know that I value, like, I don't know, I exist just as much as that thing over there exists. Like, that's okay. It's like that identity of self is not something I am consciously aware that I have brought back to present. But anyways, I do think that, like, saying that, okay, so then instead, like, taking on the mentality of, like, but nothing matters, so nothing I do matters, it doesn't matter. Like, I think that's an easy segue to doing things that don't Oh, okay, this really feels psycho. I think if you it's not if you don't identify with the self, but if you don't take advantage of the fact that you are a human being and you have the ability to do actions and say things and make things or do certain things, like, then you're wasting an opportunity, or a lot of opportunities, actually.
Absolutely.
And that's just how I see it. But I mean, that doesn't mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't, that you have to identify with the self to take action. And that also doesn't mean that if you don't identify with the self, you won't take any action. And
Right.
maybe I just don't see or haven't seen the connection between, the connection between, I don't know how to phrase this, the connection between just going with the flow of the world and making sure that you actually live a life that you like / want to /
right,
where you respond to the world in a way in which you agree with.
Absolutely. I feel like this segues into, you know, maybe what might be the final topic for us to really look at here, because it's something that's been sort of revealing itself to me recently. This has been the perspective shift that's been happening the past few weeks, actually.
Huzzah!
Yeah, no, and it's like you said, it's very exciting. But first, to lead into that, actually, and just respond to what you said, there was this quote from someone, Jim Newman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. But yeah, he had a meeting last week where someone asked him about cows, and if cows grieve the same way humans grieve, or if there's a difference because of, thought or whatever. And he said basically there isn't any difference because we're all mammals. What he's and what he said the difference might be in, someone believing that it's happening to an individual. And the way he said it is, he says there doesn't need to be an individual for there to be a sense of loss.
Right.
And then another friend of mine added in, or a sense of anything, a sense of justice, or a sense of like, passion to go down a certain career or artistic route, or, something, like with romance or whatever, like all of these things are human things that arise, that could arise or not. And it's all permissible in non-duality. Like non-duality doesn't say anything is better than anything else in that sense, or you shouldn't do this because there's not a person there, or because there is or isn't free will. It doesn't, there's sort of a natural human drive to do everything that we do.
Wait, so what was the overall perspective shift that you've been coming to recently?
Okay, yeah, that was a bit more of a tangent. I just wanted to reply to what you said with that. The perspective shift, which I really feel like I'm going out on a limb when I talk about this, because it's not a concept that's really out there yet too much. But I feel like there's a I want to even speculate that there might be a global shift or a cultural shift that's happening. And we're coming out of a period of thousands of years of, what some call patriarchy, or you could just say like a male dominated perspective on things, or a masculine energy perspective on things, or to put it more harshly, I would call it narcissistic. To put it more impersonally, there's the yin yang symbol. So the yin is sort of this, non-gendered version of that. But basically, I listened to this one lecture by this guy named Matt Kahn a week ago, or a little more than a week ago. And he has a lot of things that I don't resonate with, a lot of talk of, just things I would consider a little more new age and woo-woo. But he made this really interesting point to me that to someone who is more of the masculine energy or yang energy, or maybe even narcissistic, that the non-dual message has this great power in it to sort of soften and relax. It's like a balancing thing almost psychologically, like on every level. It's it's because to a character that takes themselves so seriously as a defense mechanism against the uncertainty of the world, which is basically narcissism in a nutshell. It's like feeling like you have to show the world an identity and you have to believe it's real to protect yourself. And that's not something anyone chooses. It's just we all have these personality traits that emerge from early childhood as coping mechanisms. But for that kind of individual to say that no one is there and nothing is happening actually can balance out that very strong, fiery energy of narcissism or yang energy or whatever, masculine energy. And so for someone who's more feminine energy, which I would include myself in that category, I would say I'm slightly more feminine energy, though I'm, male-bodied, and whatever. But I mean, it's, it feels like actually the non-duality perspective comes more easily in a way. It feels more natural. It feels like once you see it, it's so obvious. It's not like this. So that might be another element actually in the difference of how we experienced that, and it wasn't so traumatic. Because yeah, the feminine energy sort of lives there already. It's just like, oh yeah, duh. There are no things. Like when I talk to my mom about non-duality, which I rarely do, but when I do, or when I ask her if she would read one of my poems, or I watched like a Ramana Maharshi documentary with her a couple of years ago, she's just like, yeah, I get it. Like, okay. And, but she's just like, yeah, like she gets it. And it's like, but it's not like something she needs, because she just lives there. She's like just this very loving woman who's just awesome. And she lives in this place of not identifying strongly as being anything really. And so from the feminine energy, it's almost like duality is more important, which sounds crazy to say on a non-duality. Well, my podcast could cover anything, but I know a lot of people listening to this, this is not something they're used to hearing, but I would just say that the feminine energy, that this perspective shift can be so organic to, it's like actually the other side of the coin is like not doubting yourself. It's like in the way that like a narcissist type person never doubts themselves. So non-duality adds doubt that balances. Like someone who's on the opposite side pathologically would be codependent. So I have been codependent, and there's always this doubting of oneself, and being around narcissistic people who are telling me what the answer is and I don't quite have it. But no, it's like the actual reality is no, there is no right answer. Nobody has it. And this is all non-dual perfection already that's unknowable, unspeakable. And so whatever flows through there, that's whole already. And embracing your own expression of it, you know, and just that's sort of the that's the other side of the coin from the yin energy perspective. So that's the perspective shift that I'm still processing it, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think okay, so like what you said about like the non-dual perspective coming more like seemingly naturally to more feminine energies, if you want to put it that way. Like, I definitely agree. And based on other things I've read about these like feminine versus masculine energies, like I've read some Ayurveda and stuff like that in books that have talked about that. And yeah, I agree that it would be more natural. And it makes me think about, I don't remember who you were quoting, but you were talking about how someone said that like you don't have to acknowledge the individual. Like there doesn't have to be a self or person there in order for any of it to be significant. And I think maybe there's a connection between that and like the feminine energy potentially like not having like such dual boundaries like that, like you were talking about. Yeah, and that's actually super cool. Yay! I didn't have a conclusion. I just think that's great. It's a good connection.
Awesome. Yeah. No, it's yeah, and I feel like this is a journey that's unfolding, and it's not even, I wouldn't even call it non-duality, I would just call it life. You know, like life has apparently evolved up to this human form, and humans created non-duality. Like it's just a word, it's a concept, it's a response to other things that we could talk about. You know, you can't say non-duality is a thing, and if there weren't humans, no one would be aware of non-duality. So I feel like in the same way, there's just so many emergent things in the world, you know, and I feel like this what I perceive as an imbalance of a majority of, you know, masculine, even narcissistic energy in many areas of the world, including spiritual speakers and stuff like that. It's like this hierarchy where there's one person on a podium with flowers behind them in a picture that of some other dead dude, and it's like this gives the perceived authority, and then everyone comes up to them and just wants to have their question answered, and they want to be corrected and how they're not quite getting it. And I feel like there is a place for that, and I feel like that is very valuable, but I feel like there's also a place for people to just sort of explore their own voice, their own intuition, their own expression of this, which could be not even talking about it, but painting or music or poetry, and sort of exploring their own expression and not needing it to be validated by somebody on a throne who's having their feet kissed, you know?
Something that made me think about that I think is like ties majorly into at least my perception of non-duality and why the realization of non-duality was so great for me and why I was like, this is awesome, like great perspective. Good job, me and my friend. Is because so I've always like throughout my life I've constantly had moments where I'm like where this internal belief of just like the equality of everything has arisen. And I've been like, cool, good to know I think that deep inside, right? I just like have this deep founded belief that everything is just very equal because it is. Like, I mean, I just believe that. And I can't go, I can't justify my beliefs or anything like that. But I think that's one of the reasons that this realization of non-duality, and that for me, like, it was the realization that everything in my reality is a product of my perception, like, was so great because I was like, no, everything's literally equal. I just like perceive it of different value. Like I perceive different things of different value, and it just like it epitomized, or it didn't epitomize, but it like whole truth of like my underlying belief of equality of everything. And that was something I really enjoyed because I think that's also super valuable for people and probably for their realizations of this perspective shift and whatnot. It's because it relates to like what you said. It's like you don't need to. Sometimes it's useful for some people. That's great. But you don't necessarily need to put yourself in this like hierarchy system of like one day if I can speak as good as this one philosopher or this one speaker at some point in time, then I will have the realization and then it will be fine. Like that isn't how it has to happen, and you don't have to put that obligation on yourself. I don't know. That's something I think that the non-duality perspective like brings to my life. I just really enjoy it.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I agree absolutely. And I would also just say, it feels to me like even if someone's, let's say, seeking and feels like they don't get it, or you could say anyone would say, well, they're seeking and they don't get it. There's still just a wholeness and a beauty to that. Like there's nothing like the equality you're talking about. It's like it's not more or less beautiful to speak with confidence or to be curious or to be wrong and make mistakes. It's all just equally an expression of life that I would say is just happening on its own, apparently.
Yeah, that's so relating real fast to the non-duality group that we talk in every week. So something I really, really enjoy about that group and about openly talking about philosophies is that it's not about comparison. Like if as soon as someone you take a philosophy like non-duality or whatever your other philosophy is and start making comparisons of like, but he's doing it the right way and he's not, it's like you're missing the point. Like that's not it. Like the point is not to compare how people are experiencing their life. It's like you said, it's all an experience and like it's their experience, and that's great.
Yeah, and I feel like there can be this play, this like sort of like dance between people's experiences and expressions where, yeah, it's not about right or wrong, but it's about, oh, well, that makes me remind me of this or want to say this, which could be an agreement or an apparently disagreement, but it's all just flowing. No, yeah.
Yeah, that's actually so okay. Kind of jumping back for me at least, jumping back in time. When I started coming to like some of the non-duality meetings, like that connection was like awesome because it was just like a perspective that my friend and I had come to while like reading philosophy in a hammock one day, because like what else do you do on your lovely Saturdays? I don't know. And so for me it was just like a perspective that like I had and my friend was aware of, and I was like, cool. And then when I discovered this like non-duality group, I was like, there's an entire group of people around the world who have also had this realization. I was like, no way. And so yeah, so that was the connecting point for me where I was like, that's awesome.
Totally. And that brings to mind, it's even just like very, it feels good, to have people to relate to and to share things you have in common with, just at a very basic level, Yeah, like, yeah, that's awesome, Maisie. And just so anyone who's watching or listening knows, yeah, I do host a non-duality discussion group where I'm the facilitator and host, but there's no teacher per se, where everyone's free to share in it. who's respectful of others' time and whatnot. And anyone who's interested, feel free to contact me on Facebook, Art Pinsof.
And it's nice because their group doesn't make any comparisons. It's really cool. I like it. It's very open.
Well, thank you, Maisie, for, I'm glad that you enjoy it, and I really enjoy having you be a part of it. You add a great value to it when you're there. It's really nice.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
And so I think, wrapping up here, what I sometimes I like to ask at the end of these interviews, like, what are some of your favorite things that maybe you haven't mentioned? You said you love plants.
I love plants. They're so cool.
Awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to mention? Give a shout out to that you love?
Everything. I love people. I love the fact that this is also perspective, but I love the fact that I think it's like everything is nothing and nothing is everything. But in the end, as far as like humans go, and the fact, for me, it ties into what we previously talked about the fact that you can't change anything that is. Like, that fire is still fire, regardless of whether or not I want to believe it's a fire or not. Like, I think that, like, we're all just kind of here, and we're all just kind of humans, and we're all just like here to kick butt together, and like that's okay. And like I really like that, and I really like plants. And
humans and plants. Yes.
Yeah, plants are so cool though. Like, do you know anything about mushrooms? They're amazing. They're just so weird. I love them.
I've heard. Yeah. Do you have have you heard of Paul Stamets?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I've heard him talk about them, and I think I have his book somewhere. Yeah, mushrooms. To me, everything in life is incredible. Like last year, I got on like a kick of watching like nature documentaries of insects and snakes.
Nice.
I watched this one incredible documentary. I don't know how much of it was like fake, but because it's hard to believe this was a real thing, but they followed this single king cobra through India, like for like 2 or 3 months. And it was like this epic journey of the snake, trying to mate and getting rejected, but then mating eventually. And then like humans were coming after it at one point, and and then it had to hibernate, and then it shed its skin. It was just like this epic story, like a Disney movie about a cobra. And it's just amazing. And to me, when I watch those things, it makes it all feel just like more beautiful and less special. It's like more special and less special because everything is just amazing. Like I watched a documentary on praying mantises. And they're also just amazing. It's just everything is amazing. And maybe because of this conversation, now I'm going to get into plants more, and I'm going to watch some plant documentaries.
Do it. Plants are super cool. But yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, everything in the world is. I'm gonna shout out to the universe. Super cool. It's doing a good job.
Do you have any favorite plants, people could Google that you think is interesting to look up?
Oof. Not necessarily. I do think that like parasitic plants are super interesting. It's like Venus flytraps. That's one kind of parasitic plant. But there's also like vines that grow on other things, and like pitcher plants that have like they're like toxins at the bottom, so like bugs fly into them because they smell good.
Yeah. And
they like get stuck in this toxic acid or whatever it is. And I think that's super cool. Plants in general, I think, are really cool because, sorry, this is a brief shout out. I think plants are super cool because in the last few years, I have like used them to like treat medical issues. And then that made me think about the fact that actually like everything, or maybe not everything, but like most of the medicine that we have in the modern world comes from plants.
Right.
I mean, because that's what like got our ancestors through whatever. That also is what gets indigenous people through life. Like there's this one time I was in South America and I was living on a farm at the time, and I got parasites, and I was like, crap. And so I went to the farmer and I described my symptoms, and they were like, "You see that plant over there?" And I was like, "Yes." And they were like, "Cut a piece of it, let it dry out, drink the tea with that plant 3 times a day for a week, and you'll be fine." And I did that and my parasites were gone. And then I got another kind of parasite, and I also treated them with plants. Woo!
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. And gosh, yeah, I know it brings to mind, there's another thing I think I heard you mention that we didn't get into. If you wanted to touch on it briefly, you could, or I could edit this part out. But what about plant medicine in terms of psychedelics? I think you might have mentioned you drank ayahuasca at one point. Is that something you'd like to talk about?
For
sure.
I'm super down to. I don't really have any boundaries. If you ask me a question, I will tell you it. It's fine. But I don't necessarily feel the need to like say anything in particular about something. If you have questions, I'm super down to talk about it.
Well, first of all, I'm curious about, let's just say as a final topic here, the ayahuasca experience in relationship to this perspective shift. Is it a totally different thing? Did it deepen this? Did it come before or after this? What's the relationship between that experience you had and this perspective shift, if any?
Okay, so I'm gonna say two things about that. So the first thing is kind of off topic, but so when I did ayahuasca, random, it was just like I was living in the jungle in Peru, and I needed a place to stay because I was in a tiny community, and the person I was helping take care of her wild animals, and she was like, yeah, there's another extranjero, like a foreigner, nearby. You can talk with her, see if she has a room to stay in. And I was like, cool. So I stayed with this extranjera, and then on the third day I was staying with her, I read this sign in the front of her house, which somehow I had not noticed, and I was like, ayahuasca. Oh, it's like, well, that changes things. So I ended up just doing ayahuasca just because I was living with an ayahuasca shaman for 2 months. And other people came to do ayahuasca sessions with her, and I became friends with these people, and then they invited me to their sessions, and then we all did ayahuasca. And so, okay, that was a little premise.
Sure, yeah.
One of my friends, and I think a long time before I had done ayahuasca or even knew anything about it, because I didn't know anything about ayahuasca. I knew it was a drug and a psychedelic, and I was like, cool, and that's all. That was it. My friend was like, yeah, ayahuasca shows a person to themselves. And then when I was on ayahuasca, I was like, so true. I was like, it does. It very much. It shows a person to themselves, in such a way where it's I don't know how to describe this. It's probably different for everyone, but for me, it was the things that are very super true about you, or things that you think and you believe deep down. It's just here you are, here, this is what it is, and you're like, cool. For me, it wasn't that shaking. It wasn't that different, because previously I had this experience where everything that I knew was taken from me, including myself. So
Right.
when that was shown to me through ayahuasca, I was like, yeah, it's familiar, it's fine. I was like, cool.
No, that's really interesting, because this is another thing we sort of have in common then in our experience that I think most people don't say or have as their perspective of this or experience of this. When I first smoked DMT, which is the same chemical in ayahuasca, I had just had this month-long experience of really, really, really intense, life changes, Mm-hmm. And I was really just putting myself more out there, so to speak, in more of a vulnerable, out there, living life to the fullest way than I ever had in my whole life or in years. And then just sort of as another thing to do during this time period, me and a friend of mine who kind of was sort of a guide to help me in this direction at the time, he, or just a friend, yeah, but we smoked the DMT, and I remember my feeling of it is, oh, this is already 95% the way I feel right now. I just climbed up to a cave on the side of this, it's not a mountain, but here in Austin there are these I don't even know what you call it, but these rock formations. I climbed up, and I have an extreme fear of heights for my whole life. So I was just overcoming these fears and just living life to the fullest, really. And it's when I discovered my bisexuality as well, and that was a big part of it. Just sort of realizing all these things about myself already that were sort of revealed. So when I smoked the DMT, it was like, oh, well, this is already, but it sort of felt to me like life becoming like a lucid dream, which DMT is actually a chemical that's already in our brain that's released in deep sleep. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of that's sort of my theory of it a little bit, is if you live life as if it's a dream, which who's to say it isn't, then anyway, I mean, you answered my question, and then I shared a little bit about my story.
No, I'm glad. That's great.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. You sharing your experience about the ayahuasca and mine. I think people will enjoy this interview. It was really great talking to you, Maisie.
It was lovely to talk to you as well. I hope you have a great day or evening or whatever time it is there.
It's still day here, but yeah, I hope you have a good evening and good sleep tonight.
Thank you. All right, I will maybe see you on Sunday.
All right, cool.
Nonduality talks cool. Bye.
Bye.